I feel honored to welcome our guest, Mr. Valdemar Prado. He has been a member of World Association for former United Nations Interns and Fellows, and since 2003 as a Senior Research Fellow in Science and Technology for Development, and currently serving as an Executive Vice President of the organization. He has been teaching and on research positions at several universities in Mexico, Latin America, and US. During this time, he has been involved in developing and implementing technology solutions for development in emerging and developing countries. Held professorship in physics, mathematics, computer science, biomedical science, and technology. He has been commissioned to participate in the different forums and conferences at ECO, SOC, DPI, and WSIS in topics related with the impact of ITCs and development, as well as the transfer of technology at the United Nations. He also has been involved and consulted in financing for development projects for communities in several regions of the world. He also has been consultant, advisor, and facilitator for science and technology transfer for the government of Chile, Colombia, Peru, Dominican Republic, Honduras, Bolivia, Costa Rica, Panama, Venezuela, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Brazil, and Mexico. Also in the areas of creation of local capacities. So, ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together to welcome Mr. Valdemar Prado.
Hello. Thank you for that kind introduction. My previous speaker already spoke about the kleshas and gave a general understanding of what they are. Klesha is a term that is used often in yoga to mean obstacles, afflictions, sometimes even is translated as poisons for our mind. And it's kleshas in general, diminishes or distorts our consciousness and bring misery and pain in our lives in many forms. It also is an obstacle that hinders our meditation and prevents us from rising to the state of concentration and samadhi. And as mentioned before, there are 5 kleshas: avidya, asmita, raga, dvesha, avinivesha. Those are the 5 kleshas that are mentioned in the sutras 5 and 6 of the Patanjali Yoga Sutras. The second one after avidya is asmita, and it is said in the classic literature that avidya is the source of all the kleshas, all the obstacles that we have in our lives. Sometimes these kleshas come from things that we generate in this life, but sometimes come from before. In general, the second one is translated asmita, is translated as egotism or egoism. What it means originally, asmi means I am, which is pure awareness of, pure consciousness of self-existence. But when this pure awareness becomes in contact with Maya, then it changes into I am this or I am that, and then the ego takes place in this, and it takes the whole picture and it becomes or wants to become the main character of the movie. And so we said here that when asmita it's distorted by avidya, then when it becomes in contact with Maya, then it's taken over by avidya. And the translation also is, of avidya is blending together as if it were of the power of consciousness, which is Purusha, with the power of cognition, that is Buddhi. And here, I will try to give an explanation of the concept of ego in the Western tradition of psychology and psychotherapy. When we are born, basically we are a blank page. And as we start being raised by our family or whoever, then we are given a name, a last name, and a family, a language, a religion, uh, so on and so forth. So all these things are attached to us so that we can have self-awareness or awareness of the self. And the problem with this is that as time goes along, we cannot distinguish between our inner self or consciousness and the things that we created to identify ourselves. And they take over. And in general, we gradually lose more and more awareness of our real self. And this is a problem because in what is called in religions often as sins or obstacles, uh, in psychotherapy and psychology are called neurotic processes. So most of our neurotic processes come, according to psychological sciences, from not being in the present moment or just reacting to memories or to traumas that we had during our childhood. Our uh, psyche has the same as our body, it has self-preserving mechanisms. And as we grow between usually the age of 1 and 7, then we face different obstacles. When we can resolve these obstacles and we have the energy to break them, then we go to the next stage. So we are growing by stages, usually 5, 7 stages in our growth. But when we don't have, because of the circumstances, sometimes because we just don't have the ability or the strength to overcome these obstacles, then they are thrown in the back of our minds or the subconscious, and they stay there until we are ready to solve them. And so they come back as intents to manifest them every time we face the original situation that created this neurotic process, this trauma, this complex or inhibition. And we act in the same way that we acted in the beginning to resolve these problems. So, and this whole structure is, in for instance, Freud called it the ego, the superego, and the id, which is, the id is our biological part, our impulses, our cravings, our desires, so on and so forth. Then the superego is the structure that is imposed in ourselves by the religion and the social constructs that guide us to live in society. And so it's like a supervisor of how we do in society. And then the ego is the one that mediates between the two, the one that actually presents itself to our interactions with the community or our close beings or fathers, mothers, couples, or society in general. So our life goes from childhood to when we have all the parts of our psyche completely developed through this process of growth in which several identities are created in our lives. And these sometimes we identify so much with these identities, with these processes, that we forget who we are. We forget our inner self. And in psychotherapy, there are different techniques that sometimes were learned from the ancient Eastern philosophies, such as yoga, Taoism, Buddhism, and so forth. So here is where the two streams come together. East and West, they come together. In the Eastern philosophies, there were several streams of thought that defined in different ways what we call ego. Uh, for instance, in Buddhism philosophy, the ego is totally denied. They say it doesn't exist. And to some extent, it coincides with the Vedanta philosophy, especially the Advaita Vedanta. But in Advaita Vedanta, there is a clean distinction between what is our personality and the Atman, the inner self. All these things that were created during our growth get resumed or summarized in what's called the personality. Personality is a term that comes from the Greek word persona. Persona means mask. This is the mask that we put in ourselves to present to society. The problem that we have here is that very often we identify so much with the mask that the mask takes over. In other words, the ego takes over. And then it blurs our pure consciousness. It put layers and layers of blurring into our internal self. So the some of these philosophies came at the turn of the last century, and so our psychology, in this sense, is a very new science. Whereas the Eastern philosophy, such as yoga and the others that I mentioned, they have thousands of years of experience. And the main difference is that in the Eastern philosophy, we turn our in the Western sciences, we turn our attention outside in order to find the truth. In Eastern philosophy, we turn first the attention inside through meditation, so that we can study what happens inside of us, and then we achieve experience through that. And so it was mentioned by our previous speaker, what is the solution? What Patanjali proposes as a solution for this problem? Okay, several Vedanta teachers got into this description of this problem. For instance, Shankaracharya says, the right vision is the direct adversary of the kleshas, since ignorance is the root of all evil, and ignorance is destroyed when directly confronted by the right vision. The purpose of the tapas and others is samadhi, meditation, the thinning of the kleshas. Tapas and the others are actions, and as their aim is yoga, they are themselves called yoga. Yoga is the mental state of samadhi, and this yoga of action, kriya, aims at that he who practices this is a yoga. In other words, Sankaracharya and Patanjali, they propose basically yamas and niyamas in order to thin these kleshas. And they propose tapas, which is to live a frugal life, accesses or tapas, svadhyana and svara pranidhana. So self-study or self-reflection and the devotion to some higher power of being, svara pranidhana. And by doing this, by practicing this, which people usually don't, especially in the West, they don't associate with yoga. For instance, devotion or knowledge, self-knowledge, or accesses are basically, they are extracted from the yamas and the niyamas. These are the niyamas, basically. So if we practice the yamas and the niyamas, then we are in the path of yoga. And as it was mentioned before, in Western, when we talk about yoga, we basically talk about, we mean asanas. And that helps too, and that is important too. It's something that would put us on the path to thin the kleshas. And so in order to deal with what's called the egoism, which is self-importance, or identifying ourselves with what is not. For instance, I identify with my body. I think I am my body, and then I think I am my emotions, and then I think I am my mind, my thoughts, which is totally false. They are parts of a chariot, or I think it was Swami Vivekananda who mentioned that it is like a chariot. The human being is like a chariot or chariot. Uh, you have the chariot itself, which is the body, the wheels, and the box, and the part of the chariot. Then you have the horses, uh, who are basically the ones who put in motion the chariot, which are, the horses, the emotions. And then you have the mind, which is the driver and has the reins, or doesn't has the reins with the horses and direct the horses. But the chariot has also a passenger, and this passenger inside is the one that has the mission to experience the world. And if these four elements are not put together in the proper order, then problems arise. In general, if we think we are the chariot, we are the body, then it takes over the whole attention of the human being. And the same happens when we identify too much with the emotions or with our thoughts. As a matter of fact, the first sutras of Patanjali say that it is important to control the vrittis. It says, Yogaha Chitta Vritti Nirodha. Yoga is the control of the turmoils of the mind. And so the whole topic of this focus on the ego, the egoism, the selfishness. When we misidentify the different parts, which are basically tools or instruments for our experience of life, but they are not in themselves, the real self, the inner self. So it's important that we, as mentioned before, we get the right vidya, the right knowledge, and that's why it's important, to take into practice into our daily lives a constant reminder of, our internal awareness, our real self, our inner self, and do not confuse this with the other parts or the other instruments. For instance, the third uh, uh, the third klesha is raga, which means attachment, and the next one is dvesha, which means aversion. And we usually spend our lives between clinging or desiring or rejecting things. And the last one is avinivesha, which means the fear of living, or the fear of dying. So again, the solution to avoid becoming entangled with the ego is to practice yamas, niyamas, pranayama, asanas, pratyahara, and the rest of the 8 ashtangas. So this is where I'm going to stop, and I hope that I gave you a wide explanation of what Asmita is and why it's so important to not fall trap of the playings of the ego that enshrines itself as the master. And it's important to have an ego, but it's important that the ego accomplishes its mission, not to take over the inner self and cover our inner consciousness with all this blurring of desires and pain and obstacles that blur our minds. Thank you. Namaste.
Namaste. Thank you very much, respected Valdemar ji. Thank you very much for discussing on a very important topic for understanding of Yoga Sutra, Asmita. You rightly mentioned when comes in contact with Maya, then wrong identification happens, and it is, as you said, called as egotism or egoism. You also connected it with the Sigmund Freud theory of id, ego, superego. You also mentioned about how persona is a mask, and that mask takes over our own existence and our own thinking. From there, raga and dvesha takes birth. As a solution, you mentioned that Adi Shankaracharya mentions about right vision. You also mentions the importance of tapaswadhyaya and Ishwar Pranadhama, the niyamas, as a solution to go beyond, to see beyond this limited identity. Chittas, and this limited identity brings vrattis in the chitta, as you mentioned. You also mentioned as a remedy, Astangik Marg. Thank you very much for enlightening us with the topic and blessing us today. Thank you.
On behalf of United Consciousness, I thank Mr. Valdemar Prado for coming onto the platform of United Consciousness and sharing his views. Thank you so much.